And thanks all for joining this webinar, which is part of our Jockey Corp AI Community Innovation Program, which this program actually aims to provide AI training to the underserved youth. So we provide different kind of community workshop for the school and also for the NGOs. At the same time, we did a capacity building workshop for the industry as well. So it includes like the teachers, social workers, and everyone who are interested in the AI area, because we believe that in the whole ecosystem, if we want to provide more training for the young people, we need a lot of different kind of people to get involved and also know what is the potential and also the future of AI. So today it's really great that we have Kevin join us as our guest speakers. So maybe let me pass my time to Kevin to share a bit on the generative AI and how it affects the jobs and the career in the futures.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it, and thank you to all participating folks today. I know you guys are busy, probably have a lot of things going on, so appreciate you guys spending a little bit of time with us. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about a few aspects of generative AI. So I'll talk about a few sort of interesting applications that we're seeing. I'll talk a little bit about kind of what it can and can't do, and then also I think most importantly the effect of jobs that generative AI will have on jobs and careers in the future, because I think it's relevant for everyone, right? So even if your career is not even started yet and you're still in school, I think it probably matters for you. And also even if you're at multiple stages in your career as well, I think it's going to make an impact going forward. Okay, so in that case, we'll go ahead and get started. So really quick introduction about myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Pereira. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, actually, so spent a lot of time here. So when a few folks, told me that we will see some young potential participants today, I was very excited because many years ago I was in your guys' shoes as well. And I finished my high school in Hong Kong, and I went to South Island School here. So some of you may know that school. So in terms of my professional background, or in terms of education and things like that, I studied business when I was undergrad. And then my first job was actually working as a private banker over with Citi in New York. Okay, so I was doing private banking. I was in the finance world. And then eventually, after about 6 or 7 years, I decided to go to MBA school in France and Singapore. And that was really my first change into technology, right? Because part of the reason I wanted to go back to MBA was to change from finance into tech. And so my first job in technology was actually working in Myanmar. So some people also call it Burma as well. And so I was doing internet infrastructure in Burma. So we were basically building anything that was needed for your mobile phone to work. So you can imagine your fiber optic cable in the ground, your cell phone towers, your data centers. We were building a lot of that stuff in Myanmar. So it was quite interesting. I really enjoyed it. And although I think the technology was very interesting, Myanmar was also a somewhat hard place to live when you get used to the comforts of Hong Kong. So eventually I moved back to Hong Kong and I joined a company here called Blu Artificial Intelligence, which I'll talk about in a second. But in addition to my normal day job at Blu Artificial Intelligence, I also am a part-time lecturer at a few different schools in Hong Kong, so HKU and HKUST, and I teach courses there to MBA and undergraduates about artificial intelligence and big data as well. And then in terms of the company that I work in, so super quickly, we do AI consulting and also AI education as well. I think we found that, for a lot of different parts of Asia, I would say that many companies and many people are still a little bit early to artificial intelligence. Although with generative AI, I think that's changing, and I'm very happy about that. But I think when you're not familiar with something, you could be a little bit scared about it, right? And so to address that fear, I think you definitely need education. And so that's why at my company, we do education for corporates, and then we also do education for academia as well, meaning universities. And so both myself and the other guys at Blu Artificial Intelligence were also university professors as well. So we do AI education for universities and corporates, and then we also do AI consulting for businesses. Okay, so enough about the background, right? I think the important part really is why we're all here tonight. And we're here because we wanted to talk about generative artificial intelligence, but But before we talk about generative AI, I think it's important to quickly discuss what is artificial intelligence itself. And if you use Google and a bunch of these other search engines to look up what AI is, you'll probably see something like this here, which is basically a simulation of intelligent human behavior or a computer's ability to imitate intelligent human behavior. But I like to think of AI when I talk to clients and also students. I like to talk to them about AI here, okay, in this specific definition, which is simply that AI is a tool to achieve an objective. And I think if you think about AI that way, then what it does is it actually makes it a lot less scary. And I think it makes people feel that they can control it and they can use it, right? Which I think is a very positive thing to do. And then also what it does is it forces people to think about what is your objective, right? So even when you're using generative AI, for example, I don't think it's necessarily good to use generative AI for the sake of generative AI. The question always is, what am I trying to do? And then is AI or generative AI the thing that's supposed to help me, right? To be able to get there. So I think that's quite important. So now that we've kind of thought about AI as a tool to achieve an objective, then I want to look at one specific area of AI that's recently become much more important, which is the area of generative artificial intelligence. And so the way to think about generative AI and why it's different to AI from before is that generative AI is really about creating content and creating new content. Okay, and typically that content comes in four main sort of formats or structures, if you like. And those four main sort of methods are text, speech, image, and video. And so I think all of those are quite interesting in terms of seeing the output of generative AI. So if you imagine for text, right, you can use generative AI to write emails. If you think about images, you can use AI to create logos, design pictures. A lot of companies are also looking to use it for product design. So before, designers had to think about, the design completely from scratch, but now they can ask AI to come up with some product concepts. So let's say a different type of chair. And then once we ask the AI to combine the chair with something else, the designer can use those initial ideas by AI as inspiration for their design in the future, right? So images, very useful as well. And then I think for the most part, we're also seeing some companies on the newer edge of generative AI also starting to use it for speech and video. Okay, and if I have enough time today, I'll talk and show you a marketing campaign that is actually utilizing that. So this is not necessarily something that is just sort of theoretical that people are talking about. We are seeing generative AI being used in business today. Okay, so if I get a chance at the end, I'll show you a little bit of audio and video as well that I think might be interesting. But on a high level, for a lot of these tools that we see, there's a specific process, right, that is used to train these models to make them good. And that process on a high level is basically these three steps over here. Now, with each different tool, it's going to be slightly different. But for the most part, you can think of the training process as these three steps. So the first step is learning, where we give the AI a lot of data. And then when we give the AI all that data, it learns to go and identify patterns and then use those patterns to predict what's then coming in the future. Okay, so if you imagine, for example, like a sentence, right? You can have, let's say, 3 words in the sentence, and the generative AI model then has to predict the 4th word, right? So that would be an example when you use something like ChatGPT, where it's just getting really good at doing the next word that's coming. Okay, so that's kind of the idea in terms of these generative AI models. They learn from things we give them before, and then they find patterns in what we give them, and then they use it to predict which sort of item is coming next, maybe which word is coming next, and then based on that, they generate new content. Okay, so the 3 steps: number 1 is learn, number 2 is predict, and then finally, number 3 is generate. Now, when it comes to the areas I talked about before, there are actually a lot of different tools that are out there as well, right? So for example, we've got ChatGPT, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but Google also has Bard, and then a few different other technology companies also have their own individual tools as well, right? And it's been interesting, as I've been a professor at a few of the universities in Hong Kong, some of those universities are also trying to come up with tools for their students as well. So it's quite exciting to be seeing what new tools are coming out. and how these tools are actually being used. Now, those specific ones in the top part of the slide are the ones mainly used for text. But over in the bottom left corner here, we also see quite a few different ones that are used for image and video generation. In all of these, I probably use Midjourney the most. So this one over here. And I think one of the good parts about Midjourney is that it's actually very good at creating realistic pictures, right? So you remember I said AI is a tool to achieve an objective. So there's different tools out there. So as you start to use more generative AI, you'll probably find which tool is good for what specific use. Okay, so in my case, I really like Midjourney. And one of the reasons I like Midjourney is because the output is very realistic. Okay, and then finally, there's quite a few other tools out there that also generate speech, text, and music. In case you're interested, I think 11 Labs is quite interesting. So in the Q&A, if you guys want me to go into it, I can. But basically here, you can give the 11 Labs tool speech, or I should say text, and then it takes that text and then converts it into sound, right? So basically these words will then be spoken, right? So that's kind of the idea behind what we see in terms of text to speech. Okay, so many different tools. And I think as we start to see more development in generative AI, I think this list is only going to get even more full. And I think that's a good thing because we will see more tools that all of us can use. Now, I think it's also important to realize that as we start to see these tools are going to get better. Okay, but one, I think, key trend to keep in mind is that whenever we see development in AI, it tends to be exponential rather than linear. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So basically, when you have exponential growth, it's this curved line over here, okay, which means at the beginning, it's very small improvements, but later on, it gets really, really good very, very fast. So if you imagine ChatGPT, right? So ChatGPT, in terms of the version number, was really GPT 3.5. So the company that made ChatGPT is a company called OpenAI. And so OpenAI has not only been building ChatGPT, they've also built previous versions. And so as me, or someone I should say, who's been in AI for a while, I have seen some of the earlier versions as well. And so back in 2018, 2017, I was showing the output from the previous version of ChatGPT, which was called GPT-3 at the time. And if you looked at the output, it actually wasn't really that good. And when I showed a lot of my students the output, they were laughing. They were saying, Professor, this looks really bad. It's never going to get any better, and maybe it'll take a long time, okay, for us to really use it. But it was only a few years after GPT-3 rolled out that they launched ChatGPT last November. Okay, I can't believe it's almost been a year. It seems like a lot more. But in essence, last November, ChatGPT, or in terms of version number 3.5, basically gets rolled out to the world, and then everybody starts to use it. And more recently, they've also rolled out GPT-4. Okay, and if you haven't used GPT-4, it's definitely worth giving a try. And why I wanted to show you this graph is because of that exponential growth. So GPT-4 is much, much better than ChatGPT. Okay, so you might be asking, well, what does that mean? Right? How does it actually get better? So the guys at OpenAI actually came out with a really good report, right? And it's worth reading if you're interested in this area. And they were basically looking at how much better is the different versions of ChatGPT, right? So on the right side here, we've got 3.5. And you notice that they've actually given the tools a couple of standardized tests, right? So you basically give the same test to all the different tools, and you see which one does better. And if we just take the second line here, right, the second row, so this exam is called the LSAT. So the LSAT is often used for people who want to get into law school in the US, right? Or I guess it's used for other countries as well, but primarily in the US, if you want to go to law school after you finish your undergrad degree, you have to take the LSAT. And so if you look at the results, so 3.5, which is ChatGPT, it gets a score of 149, but I think the important thing is to look at what percentile it is. Right? So percentile means that if we take everyone who does the test, ranks them from 1 to 100, GPT 3.5, ChatGPT basically comes 40th, okay, in terms of ranking. Then if we look at GPT-4, the score is 163, which doesn't seem like it's that much more, but if you look at the percentile, it's actually 88th. Okay, so it went from 40th with ChatGPT to 88th in terms of GPT-4. Okay, so this is why these generative AI tools, as we start to see newer versions, are going to get better and better. Okay, so my encouragement to all of you is try using them. And the more you use them, the better you're going to find some of these features. Now, there's many different features, right, between ChatGPT and 4. But the one that I'm most excited about, that I wanted to also talk to you about a little bit tonight, is the idea of something called multimodal input. Okay, so it sounds like a really fancy tech term, but multimodal input basically means that you can input your query or your prompt not only in terms of text, but you can also put it in terms of an image as well. And then you can put in the image to GPT-4, and they could ask it questions about an image. So an example here would be that they actually gave this picture here to GPT-4, and they asked it what would happen if the strings were cut. Okay, so you notice the picture here, it's a bunch of balloons. The balloons are tied to this heavy weight at the bottom, this anvil here, by some strings. And so they basically ask what would happen if the strings were cut. And the system responds and says the balloons would fly away. Now, to you and me, in terms of a human common sense, that's pretty obvious. But for an AI, that's actually a really hard thing to be able to do, because it needs to look at the picture, it needs to understand what's happening, and then based on a scenario that you give it, which is the strings being cut, it would actually have to know what's going to happen. Okay, so that part of it is, from an engineering perspective, a very impressive achievement. Okay, so that's something that we don't have in ChatGPT, but with GPT-4, like the next version, we're going to be able to give it images and then ask questions about images as well. Okay, so I think that again just shows how much better this stuff is getting. Now, that's really the text part, but there's also a lot of very interesting image stuff that's also being developed in terms of the tools. So I wanted to show you guys one tool tonight, which is basically what the folks over at Adobe have done. So you're probably familiar with Adobe in terms of PDF, right? But they've also come out with a tool that allows you to adjust pictures. So let me just talk through a little bit about what's happening in this demo that they have. Okay. So basically here, you can use something called generative fill. So they look at the picture, and then they use a generative fill mode, and then you can select an area of the picture that you'd like to do something with. So basically you click there so that you identify the area of the picture, and then you can ask it to generate something there. So in this case, they say yellow road lines in that area. So it goes away and then creates the yellow road lines. Okay, so remember, it wasn't there before, but now it's able to put it in, and it looks relatively realistic. If you wanted to also enlarge your picture as well, you can do generative fill. And so then it just extends the field and also extends the road too, right? Which I think is also quite impressive, just being able to see what's in the picture and then doing something with it. Okay. If we take this one, what you can do is you can select the subject in the picture. So in this case, they are going to select the deer, but they're going to change the background. Okay. And in the background, they're going to say wet alley at night. And so then we keep the deer, but we actually have the wet alley. And then if we want to add something in the picture here as well, you can just select what's there and then hit red arrow sign. And then you basically get the red arrow. And so you're able to put it in. Final example. This is a picture of like someone's vacation maybe. You can put in frozen lake with reflections. So you notice at the bottom, they actually have the frozen lake with the person's reflection there. Quite impressive. And also the sky, change it to northern lights, select what you want, and then we use the AI to create part of the picture. Okay, so that would again be an example of taking an AI tool that's out there and basically using it to generate something. Right? So remember we said generative AI before was generating content. So you're doing the same thing here. You're just using an existing picture and then changing something that's there. So I think that's quite an impressive kind of tool. And hopefully that highlights to you some of the possibilities that can be done with generative AI. Now, the one other tool that I think will be relevant for a lot of people is something called Microsoft Copilot. Okay, and this is actually something just in the last few days has been a big topic because Microsoft has announced quite a few things that are coming, specifically with their Copilot tool, not only in Microsoft Office, but also in Windows 11 as well. Okay, so for those of you who use Windows, you'll probably start to see the Copilot piece slowly being rolled out to different computers and to different regions. So the question then becomes, what can Copilot actually do? And so the idea is that they actually take GPT-4, right? So kind of the next version of ChatGPT, and start to incorporate that into Microsoft Office. And so there, about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit more than that, they actually kind of rolled out a quick video to show what was possible, right, with Microsoft Copilot. So again, I'll talk through it as well, just to show you kind of what's actually happening. And the idea is to improve people's productivity. So that's the concept. So in essence, what's happening is you can put in prompts and it can go to old documents that you have and actually create content. So in this case, they're saying draft a product announcement based on a certain thing from these files that you have here, right? So it goes away, goes to those files, retrieves the information, and then is able to actually create some output from them. Okay, so let's look at what that output is. So firstly is a product announcement. Right, so it creates a product announcement, which is pretty cool. And then you can actually ask it to, based on that information before, create a 10-slide presentation. Right? So before you'd have to create the presentation yourself, but now you can actually ask it to go away and generate the 10-slide presentation. So we see slides, they're all created there, they're all well formatted. And so that would be the PowerPoint part of it. So then let's look at Excel. So let's say you had a table of data. And then you can start to ask questions, right? Which products were the most profitable? Different types of questions that you might have. You can really put in, whatever you want. Probably the one other thing that might be interesting is for those of you that use Microsoft Teams, often when you use Teams, the AI can be listening to the meeting and actually recording what people say in terms of text. Okay, so this is like speech to text. And then based off that speech to text, you can also create the meeting minutes or record the important points from the meeting that you're having, even though you're talking over Zoom. Okay, so here these three people are having a chat, or these four people are having a chat. Okay, it scans the transcript and then creates the meeting minutes from that specific meeting. Okay, so it's able to listen to what people are saying and then summarize that meeting straight away. And likewise, the possibilities are endless. Right? Okay, so again, I think quite useful in terms of what can be done there. And this is useful for, let's say students who have to do a presentation for a class. It's also useful for maybe someone who's a bit older in their career who has to give an important presentation to either their colleagues, their bosses, or their investors. So again, I think the applicability of generative AI across the board, pretty high as well. Okay, then the final example in terms of how it's used in business, I wanted to talk a little bit about generative AI in a marketing campaign. Okay, so I'm sure all of you know who this is, but in case you're a little bit young and you don't know, this is someone called Jennifer Lopez. A while back she was quite a famous pop star. I guess she's acted in a few movies as well. So generally quite a well-known type of person. And it was interesting because recently for a company called Virgin Voyages, so I'm sure you guys must have heard of Virgin Atlantic or Virgin Records, right? So the company, they do a lot of like Virgin Atlantic, for example, does the airplanes. So they also have a company that does voyages, so cruises. And so there actually what happened is Jennifer Lopez actually sold her likeness to that company, to Virgin Voyages. And basically they created a marketing campaign based on Jennifer Lopez and the selling of her likeness. Okay. And you might be thinking to yourself, how are they doing that? Right? How are they actually able to take her likeness and kind of go from there? So final sort of example that I want to show you here is basically the idea where they take her face, so that's like the image and the sound of her voice, and they're able to mimic that using generative AI. Okay, so basically the idea here is that they can kind of use in their lab they can use the likeness, have somebody else do the talking per se, and also wearing the bodysuit so it can mimic the movements, and then generate the video for Jennifer Lopez in the actual video itself, right? So basically, that's her sitting in the studio, and then this is the output from generative AI in terms of Jennifer Lopez. Okay, so this is actually a marketing campaign that was launched, I think, about a month ago, a month and a half ago. So very, very new and recent. But in essence, Jennifer Lopez kind of gave the green light to them. She sold her likeness, and then they were able to use her likeness in marketing campaigns for Virgin Voyages going forward. Okay, so hopefully that showed you a few tools. Hopefully that showed you a few business examples. Again, if you're curious in the Q&A, happy to take the questions there. But I wanted to touch the final part of my presentation today was really about how Gen AI is going to affect jobs going forward. And I think it's quite interesting, right? Because if you look on the internet, there's many different, I'd say kind of graphs like this that show which jobs are more likely to be automated, which jobs are less likely to be automated. And I thought this chart was interesting because on the y-axis, you have how much people get paid. And on the x-axis, the stuff that's on the left side is harder to automate. And the stuff that's on the right side is easier to automate. Okay, so for example, things like waiters, cashiers, retail sales, they don't get paid that much of money. And they're also probably easy to automate. So if, for example, in Hong Kong, right, you go to like a Welcome or a Park and Shop, now, many times they have the scanning machine, so you can just scan it yourself, whatever you're buying, and then you can just pay with your card and you walk out, and you don't necessarily need the cashiers that are there as well. Right? So that would be an example of a low-paying job necessarily that also is easy to be replaced. And that might be the bad corner. So what about the good corner, right? Which would be diagonally opposite. And that would be up here, which is really you get paid a lot, but then also you're hard to automate. So examples of jobs that's kind of sit there, physicians and surgeons, we see like dentists, CEOs, like chief executives, a lot of those jobs tend to sit there. So I think what that means is, AI has had certain impact on jobs in the past, and certain jobs are more affected, certain jobs were less affected. But I think generative AI is going to affect jobs slightly differently to before. Okay, so over here we've got a table from a recent report by Goldman Sachs, where they were talking about different areas or different jobs that were affected, specifically for generative AI. Okay, and so these numbers are basically what percent of that job is generative AI, what can it actually do? So obviously if you're on the left side, like this part is bad. Right? So you have, for example, legal, some of the business stuff as well, where AI, specifically generative AI, can do a lot of what that job kind of does. Whereas on the right side over here, we tend to see that there are jobs, for example, like maintenance and repair, right? So those jobs are probably things generative AI is less good at doing. So for example, imagine that tonight in your kitchen, a pipe bursts, right? Generative AI probably can't help you with that, whereas you would really need a plumber to be able to come in and help you to address those issues. Okay, so generative AI, I think will probably have more of an impact on service-related jobs, right? So more kind of professional services, lawyers, business, that area. Whereas before, I think AI didn't really touch those jobs when it wasn't doing the generative stuff. And so that's why if you start to look at the data, right, that's out there, they also looked in that same report at which countries might be most affected. And they kind of through what they were looking at, saw that Hong Kong was probably going to be affected a lot because a lot of the jobs that we see in Hong Kong have to do with the service industry, right? So you have a lot of professional services here, you have a lot of lawyers, bankers, doctors, and a lot of generative AI can potentially affect some of those jobs going forward. So if you first look at this chart, it's a little bit scary, right? Because you start to think, oh, maybe generative AI is going to have an impact on a place like Hong Kong, where we are all currently. And so therefore the question becomes, what do we do about it, right? How do we address that? And so what I would suggest to all of you tonight is to not think about AI's effect as job automation, but think of it as task automation, right? So every job that's out there consists of certain tasks. Some of them are easy to automate, some of them are hard to automate. So the real question then becomes, in the job either that you currently have or the job that you want to get in the future, a good question to ask yourself is how many of the tasks in that job are easily automatable by AI? Okay, and so for those jobs that have a higher percentage, that could potentially be an issue. And for the jobs that have a lower percentage, that might mean that the job is a bit safer. But I think what we'll see, right, with jobs going forward is more that certain jobs are going to evolve. So let's say, for example, there's a job where 7 of the tasks are easy to automate. I think in the future, what we'll have to figure out is the human person that's responsible for the 3 things that are hard to automate. Does the human person spend all of their time on those 3, or do we put 7 new tasks into that job? Right, so that's going to become an interesting question of how jobs evolve in the future. And so therefore, I think for people to become good, I would say, complements to AI, I think it's very important to learn how to use some of these AI tools. Because I think those jobs of the future will have a lot of human people using these tools going forward. I think that we can't avoid. So my encouragement to many of you tonight is try to use things like ChatGPT, try to use things like Midjourney, and you'll find that when you try to use them, they're actually not that difficult. In fact, many of the new AI tools today, we call them low code or no code tools. And the idea behind those is that you don't need coding or programming experience to be able to use them. And actually, one of the reasons I highlighted my background at the beginning is that I've not been a computer scientist or had formal training at programming, but I'm still able to use AI, right? And if I can use AI, for sure all of you out there can also use AI as well. And so, if we think of those tasks, right, that will be easy to automate in a lot of jobs, most of those are going to be routine and repetitive. That's generally what AI tends to be good at. And I think for a lot of jobs, that's also the boring stuff too, right? So as AI comes in and takes away the boring stuff, I think it's going to free up the human being to do the more interesting parts of the job. So if I take an example from my past, I used to be a private banker before. So in private banking, the fun part of that job is meeting people and kind of, making new relationships, etc. And I think what some private bankers will tell you is that the frustrating part of that job is maybe some of the admin and the paperwork. Okay, but that also takes up a lot of your time. So imagine if an AI can come in, do the boring stuff, the admin and the paperwork, and then free you as a private banker to go and meet more clients. I think that really becomes interesting. Okay, so if you're kind of worried about this, probably the one sort of thing I tend to tell a lot of people is that you are more likely to be replaced by someone who knows how to use AI rather than by AI itself. Okay, and let me repeat that for emphasis because I think it's important. You are more likely to be replaced by someone who knows how to use AI rather than by AI itself. And so therefore my encouragement to everybody, right, whether you're a student now, whether you're in the middle of your career, is to use these tools, try them out, and you'll be surprised that the low code and no code tools, eventually they're not that difficult to use. It takes a bit of time, but eventually you'll get there. And I think it'll be a really helpful skill sort of going forward. Okay, so the final part of what I want to talk about before I open it up to Q&A is really then to start to think about how do we future-proof ourselves, right? What can we actually do? And for me, a lot of the things that humans are good at tends to be things related to human interaction. Right? So those, for example, for me, are things like what I have up here on the slide. So building relationships and trust, empathy, critical thinking, creativity. Like all of these are much more human things, right? And so therefore, these are also the areas where I think we as human beings can get a lot better because currently it's hard to automate a lot of these pieces here. Now, let me just provide one caveat though. You remember before, I said that AI is getting better exponentially, right? So it tends to get really, really good, and the newer versions can probably have new features that we never thought about before. So I would say with this list, right, these things are probably hard to automate today, but in the future, they might become easy to automate. So I think as part of our future development for ourselves, I think it's important to constantly look at this list and keep refining it. Because at a certain point, AI might get better at some of these, and then therefore you as a human being need to think about what else can you develop that AI currently struggles with. Okay, so I would say from time to time, come and revisit this and have a kind of think about what is AI not so good at, what is you as a human being, what can you be better at, and keep doing the constant learning. Right? Because I think really the answer going forward is really about creating a culture of continuous learning because as these tools get better, we as human beings have to evolve with them as well. Okay, so final kind of message for tonight: get good at the things that are hard to automate, and understand that what is easy or what is hard to automate today might become easy to automate tomorrow. Okay, so that's really kind of my final message. So I will kind of open it up in that case to Q&A from here. I've also left my LinkedIn up here and my email. So in case you are shy or we don't get to your question, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Happy to have the conversation there. But otherwise, I am more than happy to open it up to Q&A. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Calvin. And I think it's really great sharing, and I totally agree that actually we will not purely replaced by AI, but it's the other people who know how to use it or make use of the tools. So for the audience, if you have any questions, anything you want to ask, just feel free to put in the chat, or there is a Q&A function, so you can just feel free to leave your question over there. So yeah, while we are waiting the questions, Calvin, you mentioned about the 11 lab, is it?
Yeah,
So
correct.
would you mind to share more a bit on that tools?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So actually, let me just pull it up here. We can kind of look at it, and I'll probably be hard to demonstrate it in front of everyone, but I can at least show you guys what this looks like. So if I take 11 labs, let me drag it into the screen so you guys can actually see.
Yep,
So
that's
basically,
good.
this is the free version of 11 labs, right? And there, what you can do is you can type in whatever text you want. So in this case, I could say my name is Kevin, and then you hit play. So it's basically able to take whatever text you put in and then say it. And they have a bunch of different voice profiles that are out there as well, which I think is quite useful. So you can basically go down, pick different ones. So let's say we take Serena, right? So it's a little bit different in terms of the voice profile that's there. And then also for the more sort of paid version of this, and different companies do it slightly differently, you can also submit your own voice sample. So you can read a bunch of samples that are from your own voice, and then they can create something where you can have a system that actually says the text in your own voice as well, right? So you can actually create your own voice file. Now I know some people might find that a little bit creepy, or they may not kind of want to do that, but I just want to show what's possible with the technology itself. So companies like 11 Labs can do the text to speech straight away, but the more advanced sort of features, you can also have your own voice kind of being used to generate speech to text in the future as well.
I see. So actually, what kind of like in a business world? So what kind of situation or what kind of case we need to use like this kind of tools?
Yeah, so great question, right? So I think if I just maybe reflect on my own um, experience as a professor, let's say I wanted to teach a half an hour Zoom class, right?
Hmm.
Or make a Zoom lecture. But I also I want to I'm flying on a plane that same day, right? So in theory, what I could do is I could put in text of what I want to say during the half an hour lecture, and then
Hmm.
rather having to actually be there, I can just put in the text straight away, play it, and then immediately it can just run the text that I have, and then I can also create a video of the slides that's synchronized with it, so that I can create a lecture about, let's say, half an hour on generative AI, and I don't even have to be there, right? So that would be an
Hmm.
example of doing it, using it in a smart way from a business context. And so likewise, if there's a meeting, information sharing, many of that stuff, I think it's rather than just record and spend all that time recording your lecture, you can just put in the text straight away, and then it'll just say it, and you save yourself a lot of time by being able to do that.
Yeah, that's true. So you mentioned about the AI educations, which is one of your work. So from your experience, so what is your needs nowadays in Hong Kong in terms of AI education?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? So I would say in terms of what we do, there's a lot of companies that are coming to us for workshops on how to use generative AI. So that's a pretty big one as well. So in terms of like some of these tools, how do you do prompting? What types of use cases should you be using generative AI for? So we get a lot of demand for that. We're also seeing a lot of demand for how is AI being used in certain industries, right? Because the tools you would use in, let's say, healthcare would be very different to the tools you use in finance. So many companies are coming to us and saying, what are prominent use cases in our industry? So can you give our employees a little bit of awareness and inspiration for our industry? And then secondly, can you show them some industry specific tools that are relevant for them? So I think that's probably the two biggest areas currently that we're being asked about. But there's a lot of companies that are very interested in those areas for sure.
Mm. But any tools is like nowadays very common for your clients?
I would say in terms of the tools that are the most common ones, right? So for a lot of the creative firms, especially with when it comes to like image generation, for example, many of them are turning to Midjourney to do that. I think the idea there is, let's say they wanted to create a stock image for a bunch of people that are sitting in a park, right? And maybe the product is like a drink, like a water or something like that. Before, you'd have to hire a studio and you'd have to hire actors to come in and do that. But now with generative AI, you can actually do a lot of those pictures and you can actually make it pretty good overall in terms of the output. So I think a lot of like marketing collateral, copywriting, that's a huge area where many companies are trying to use generative AI for. So I would say that the function really is that a lot of creative jobs or creative areas, they're trying to move from content creation to content editing, right? So for example, the AI creates kind of the first version, and then the human being sits there and does the editing on top of it. And I think often with that, what you'll find is before, if a human being could write 10 articles a day, now with AI doing the first step, you find that the being can become more productive, right? So that's, I think, what they're looking at generative AI for: increase in productivity tools. And that, you can look at ChatGPT, GPT-4. They're very good at the copywriting for the text part. And then I think Midjourney is really good for the images and specifically doing different types of images and also doing image editing as well, like I showed before from like Adobe.
Hmm. We have one question from the audience. So let me put the question here. So I think it's a little bit related to your sharing you just shared. Is that so from your experience? So what are the key industry that are adopting AI to replace manpower?
Yeah, so I guess the question comes from Peter, right? So Peter, thank you for the question. It's a good one. So I'd say that on a high level, the industries that typically are adopting AI, and I wouldn't say necessarily just to replace manpower, but just adopting AI overall, those ones tend to be companies that are sitting on a lot of data, but don't really have much. But they have a lot of data, but they're not using it well. So in terms of our consulting clients, I would say that they fall into a few different buckets. There's healthcare, probably financial services. So I'd say it's financial services, healthcare, energy, manufacturing, and retail. I would say those are the big ones. And I think they're often trying to do a lot there. I think the law firms one, Peter, is really interesting. So I think a lot of law firms are doing it, but there's a bit of a challenge for some industries, and I think law firms are specifically one. And here's the challenge for them. So typically, right, if you use a law firm or use a lawyer, most of these law firms actually charge you by time, right? So you call the lawyer, they start the stopwatch, and then they're counting how long are they talking to you for. So imagine if I go in, and I've actually had some discussions with law firms about this, and you go in and you talk to them, and you say that I can create a tool that will take you, or what used to take you 1 hour, now takes you 20 minutes. They say, Kevin, that's a fantastic thing, but now I can only charge my client for 20 minutes rather than for an hour, and so therefore I don't want to use it. Right? So it's actually not even the fault of the technology. It's sometimes actually how is the business model for that industry being used, and then therefore that often will be a big factor as to whether or not they want to use AI or not. Okay, so it's not only just always an issue of just data. Sometimes it's about the business model too, right? And how does the business model change? Or can it? I should say how does the business model change, but can the business model support AI being used? And so for the law example, my suggestion to law firms has been, rather than charging by time, how about you charge by project or charge by milestone? Right? So like we do a certain thing, you pay us for that certain thing. And so I think if they can change their business practices, then I think in the future they might actually be able to use AI in that industry. But if they still charge by time, I think that's going to be hard for law firms to do that. Okay, so I think one of the key points to summarize, one of the main kind of determinants of whether or not industry will use AI is, do they have data? But the second part of this is, do they have a business model that supports the use of AI? In some cases, the answer is yes. In many cases, the answer is actually no.
I think it's quite interesting that I didn't think it before. Like some business model is quite related to the time they spend, and it related to the cost they can charge their client.
Yeah, very
So
much.
yeah,
So that's a great
it's
question from
yeah.
Peter, because it's very much relevant.
Yeah. So you mentioned about different kind of tools. So for the audience, like if they want to catch up the trend or like catch up the market, what is available tools in the market. So
Sure.
what they should do, like any platform or any website, they should keep update and they know that okay, it is the latest tools they can see.
Yeah, so fantastic question, right? So this slide I have over here actually has a bunch of the tools that people can use. One of the again, and I can talk about this for like 36 hours, right? Because I teach a whole course on this. But if I was to choose a few that I think are interesting, Poe over here is something that in Hong Kong a lot of people were using at the sort of at the earlier stage of generative AI. And I think one of the reasons why Poe is quite useful, and I'll pull it up and just put it in the window so people can see. Just give me 1 second here. Let me just pull it up. Okay, got it. Okay, so Poe is interesting because you can use obviously sort of Chat GPT, which is what a lot of people were using. But if you go to the bots section here, you can also use many other different tools there as well. Right, so some of these platforms don't only allow you to use like one chatbot, it allows you to use many different ones. Obviously, you have ChatGPT here, but the other quite interesting one that a lot of people are using is one called Claude. Right, so Claude was made by a company called Anthropic, and a lot of the Anthropic guys, they actually came originally from OpenAI, right? So they got some funding from OpenAI, et cetera, et cetera. So I like a few of these tools that allow you to use many things, right? So Poe is a good platform, and specifically Poe stands for Platform for Open Exploration. So the idea with Poe is that not only can you use ChatGPT, but you can use a bunch of other ones that are out there as well. Right, so Llama, for example, is one. Google Palm is the foundational model that Google has. So this is good, right? So what you can do then here is you can potentially give the same question, let's say to ChatGPT, to Google Palm, to Llama, and then see which one is good for your specific use. Right, so that's why I like Poe, and that's why I like it, because you can try many within the same sort of kind of text generation area, and then you can find which one actually works for you. So I think that's a really powerful use of this stuff. So even when it comes to like a lot of the tools I've shown here, it's not so much like which tool should everybody use. It's more about thinking for your specific use, what tool makes sense, right? And I think part of that you can get from talking to people, but I think the other part of that is you just go and play with it yourself, and then you'll find that for your specific industry or your specific use case, this will actually be helpful. So that would be my suggestion to most people. Go and try a bunch of the tools. Right? And I think as you see certain tools, you'll find some will be useful for you and others will not be useful for you. And that's okay. Right? That's nothing wrong with that. But getting that knowledge is, I think, half experience and then half also reading it about it. But I would say it's like, actually, it's probably 80% using it and 20% maybe reading about it. So I encourage everybody, try. I think that's the most important thing.
Okay, we have another questions from Vivian.
Sure.
So, as AI will take the content generation task, is it like the higher needs of junior staff from SMEs will be decreased?
Yeah, so Vivian, that's a really good question, and I think that's something actually a lot of companies are really thinking about, because historically, right, and this is probably true of SMEs, but even law firms, historically the younger guys came in and did a lot of the, for lack of a better term, like very repetitive and boring work, right? But eventually, these repetitive and boring work, people got promoted, and then they did the really fun stuff, right? So I think the question for a lot of the firms now is going to be, for the junior people, what do we do with them, right? I think that's going to be the more interesting question. And I think the truth is, a lot of the junior people will probably have to get skills at using these tools. Okay. So it's not necessarily that the juniors will not be taken on, but I think the juniors that will be in high demand are the ones that can actually do content generation, right? And do content generation in a smart way. So therefore, I think even the classes I teach at the universities, I'm encouraging all the kids to use it to try and do it for their homework. I think a lot of like traditional people might say, "Oh, ChatGPT, you're using it to cheat on your homework." But in my AI class, I actually encourage them to use it because I think in real life they will have to use it going forward, right? So I don't necessarily think it's that the junior staff will be not hired, but I think what companies will want from the junior staff will become different, right? And I think that's the key thing to consider, right? So therefore, my recommendation to a lot of the students is, try to learn the tools, right? And if you know the tools for your industry, that makes you a good person there. And what I will also say, right, Vivian, is that I think in addition to being able to generate content with AI tools, I think the skill for a lot of junior people will become content editing, right? So you see what the AI spits out at you, and then you make changes based off of that. So that is a different skill, right? And will we need fewer people? I think there's a question mark there, right? I don't know the answer to that, but I think the skills we'll need from those junior people will be different, and so that's why I think it's important to start to gain those skills going forward. Again, a long answer to a short question, but I think it's important to explore that fully because that's also questions that a lot of students are asking today, and I think it's important to think about it.
Yeah. So I think it is a really good reminder for the audience. And so I think time is running out. So Kevin, do you have any last few lines for the audience,
Sure.
especially for their career and the futures?
Sure. So sorry. There's actually a couple of questions in the chat window as well. Maybe I take one or two of those because
Yeah. Sure.
it's kind of relevant for the final thing too, right? So I think Justin's has one on can AI help editing work? So yeah, Justin. So we talked about the generation part. I think the editing, where I've seen AI being used quite a bit, is to help with like the English editing part, right? So many people are using it to like help on the grammar side or the proofreading side. But in terms of editing for like clarity of thought, good word choice, stuff like that, I think that probably we still need some humans for. Again, AI is probably exponentially going to get better, so that's probably going to be something that they can eventually do. But for now, I still think having humans doing the editing, understanding the logical flow, understanding the good word choice, that's probably still something where humans currently at least can add a bit of value. And then from Sam, there's a question of will AI replace architects or interior designers in the future? Yeah, Sam. So that's actually a really good question as well. What we've actually seen is in the case of architecture, generative AI is being often used by architecture firms to like draw like floor plans, right? And with those floor plans, what happens is you can specify criteria, right? So say for example, you have a floor plan and you ask it to design rooms where the average distance to the fire escape is minimized, right? So then it will draw a floor plan out for you that minimizes the average distance from each room to the fire escape. And then you can keep giving it more and more constraints, and that will actually generate a few different designs based on the constraints you give it. So there, I don't think it replaces the architect, but it basically gives the architect options, right? So I'm giving you 5 different designs, and then the architect might take design number 2, design number 5, and then combine it in their own way to make a really good design overall, right? So I think there, the idea is it's more about helping the idea generation part, and then getting the architect to get really good at that part, right? So being able to see kind of what's being done, combine some idea generation to come up with a really good idea at the end. So I think that's kind of my view on where like architecture goes. And a few architecture firms have come to us and talked about that. So I think that's interesting. I think on the architecture side and even interior designer, the other thing it allows you to do is prototype a lot faster, right? So you could use, for example, things like Midjourney to come up with like an interior design for a bar, right? So actually, in one of the presentations I gave a while back to a real estate firm, we actually showed them some examples of how to do design of a rooftop bar using Midjourney and generative AI. So again, I don't think the idea is to replace the interior designer, but it allows the interior designer to prototype ideas really quickly, right, and be able to kind of show them to a client to see what resonates, and then therefore combine some good ideas. And so similar to the architect, the interior designer I think can also prototype ideas a lot faster and also have AI give them inspiration too. So I think that's really interesting. Okay, and then final question I think from Winnie. Any difference of using ChatGPT in its own platform or through Poe in terms of result and quality? Yeah, Winnie, so great question. I think personally, When I use ChatGPT through Poe, it's a little bit worse than using ChatGPT directly. That's what I found. Many people seem to say similar types of feedback, but ChatGPT is just one of the options in Poe, right? So there's Claude, there's like Llama. So because you can use many other things within Poe, there's kind of like a trade-off there. But in terms of the difference between their own platform and through Poe, I've seen and people have talked about the sort of directly through its own platform, it's a bit better, whereas Poe is a little bit less good. Okay, so that's again anecdotally what I've heard, and also what people have said in terms of feedback. But there's no firm data on that. This is just what like my kind of average usage, and also other people's just anecdotal feedback. So I wouldn't say that's 100% true, but I have heard that, and my own experience kind of lines up with that. So I still think it's their own platforms tend to be a little bit better than Poe. But again, the beauty of Poe is you can use everything from one specific place. Okay, so I think that's basically it in terms of the questions I had there. Probably, my final kind of just main words, right, in the last few minutes. Number one, use the tools. I just play with them. Even if you're like embarrassed about the output, like use it in the privacy of your own home. Like don't be too concerned, and just play with it. I think the more experience you get, the better it's going to be, and I think in the future it will definitely be helpful. Number two, what I would also say is the best use of these tools are done by people who have domain specific expertise and combine the use of the tool. So, something we didn't get time to talk about is the idea of like hallucinations, where the AI can sometimes make up stuff, which is a little bit dangerous, right? And so, that you want to be a little bit careful. So, for example, even in this picture that I have here, right, it's actually created by generative AI when I asked it to do the Hong Kong skyline. But you notice it's actually put two pictures of the Bank of China building, right? Kind of. And so Bank of China Tower. And so that's something that if you were living in Hong Kong, you'd look at and you would know. Whereas if you're not from Hong Kong, you'd look at this and probably wouldn't have any idea that that's actually not the accurate skyline. Right? So something I will also say is that keep in mind that some of the output from generative AI might not always be correct. And so therefore, always double check everything, right? Always look at it. So if, for example, you're gonna use this as a realistic photo of Hong Kong, you want to be a little bit mindful of that, right? Because in this case, it's not like factually accurate. So therefore, make sure when you use AI that you double check the output. I think that's super important. So yeah, if I had two messages, it'd be number one, use the tools, and number two, when generative AI creates output, make sure you double check everything before you use it and you submit it to anyone. And again, I'm a professor, right? So I've seen many students copy and paste it. Horrible idea. Horrible idea. In fact, recently, one student, I think he asked ChatGPT to write an email, and then in the response to me, he copied and pasted it. So it actually, the email started, "Dear Professor's name." And it's kind of sad, right? Because you would think that they'd at least put my name there, but the person copy and pasted it. So again, just be mindful of trying to not copy and paste, but review the output before you ultimately use it.
Yep. I think, yeah. Thanks, Calvin. And I think it's really great sharing and very new ideas for the audience. So thank you so much for your time today. And also thanks all the participants today's I think it's a great chance for you guys to learn some new ideas, new knowledge, and we try to organize this kind of webinar more regularly. So just stay in touch with our newsletter, social medias, website, all the things, and then we will have another webinar soon. So thanks everyone, and yeah, that's all for today's webinar, and thank you so much. Yeah, bye.
Okay, thanks everybody.